You know that feeling when you want to really get something complex to see how it works and why it matters without getting bogged down in endless textbook definitions?
Hmm.
That's exactly what we're aiming for today. We're going to dive into some fundamental economic ideas, market failure and partial market failure that are actually playing out around us, in very real ways, shaping the world we live in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the ideal, I suppose, of a free market is this sort of self-regulating system, almost like, well, a natural phenomenon, where supply and demand efficiently allocate resources.
Right.
If people want it, the market, in theory anyway,
Yeah.
delivers it, and prices act as the signals that guide everything.
It's like a perfectly balanced ecosystem. But just like in nature, things don't always stay in equilibrium, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes the system hiccups, or maybe more than hiccups, and that's where this idea of market failure comes into play. The market doesn't quite deliver the optimal results for society as a whole.
And what's great about the sources we've looked at is that they offer a really tangible look at these concepts, especially as they manifest right here in Ireland.
Yeah.
So our goal today is really to extract the core insights for you, the aha moments maybe, that will make these economic forces much clearer.
Okay, so let's get right to it then.
Hmm.
Market failure. In simple terms, what are we actually talking about?
At its core, market failure is when that efficient allocation of resources by the free market, well, it breaks down.
Okay.
The result is a loss of overall well-being for society. Think of it as the market falling short of its potential to deliver the best possible outcomes for everyone involved.
So the prices we see on things that essential information in a market aren't always telling the full story. Is that it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The price mechanism, which is really the engine of a free market, it fails to accurately reflect the true costs or benefits associated with producing or consuming something. And this can lead to situations where we have, say, too much of one thing or maybe not enough of another, or resources just being used in ways that aren't truly beneficial in the long run.
Makes sense. So what are the main reasons why these market failures happen in the first place? What causes them?
Well, there are several key factors. One of the most significant is externalities.
Externalities. Okay, yeah, heard that term. Give us the lowdown. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so imagine a transaction between two parties, a buyer and a seller. Simple enough.
Mm-hmm.
An externality is when that transaction has a knock-on effect, like a side effect, on someone who wasn't directly involved at all.
Okay.
And that effect can be a cost, or it could even be a benefit. A really pertinent example, especially here in Ireland, is pollution from agriculture.
Ah,
The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, they've actually highlighted the significant impact agricultural runoff has on the health of Irish rivers and lakes.
right. So farmers are producing food and we're buying it in the shops, but there's this environmental cost, the damage to water quality, maybe contributions to climate change that isn't fully factored into the price of, say, my milk or beef.
Exactly.
It's a cost borne by everyone, like society, not just the farmer in the supermarket.
Precisely. The market price of that food doesn't internalize that environmental cost. And here's a key point from the sources. In a smaller economy like Ireland's, these environmental impacts can actually be felt quite acutely.
Mm,
They can have really long-term consequences for our natural resources, maybe even tourism.
got it. Okay, so externalities are a big one. What else can throw the market off its game?
Another crucial one is public goods. Now, these are goods that have two key characteristics.
Okay.
First, they're non-excludable. That means you can't effectively prevent people from benefiting, even if they don't pay for it.
Right.
And second, they're non-rivalrous. This means one person's use doesn't diminish another person's ability to use it.
Okay, like a lighthouse guiding ships. Or maybe something like the national defense of Ireland?
Perfect examples. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everyone in Ireland benefits from the security provided by, say, the defense forces. And one person being safe doesn't mean less safety for someone else. Now, because they're non-excludable, private companies would really struggle to provide them
No,
profitably.
why would you pay if you get it for free anyway?
Exactly. So the market would likely underprovide them, or maybe not provide them at all, which is why government funding is usually necessary.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Unlike, say, a slice of pizza, if I eat it, you can't.
Right.
But a lighthouse, or defense, benefits everyone without diminishing its value for anyone else. And you can't really put a fence around national security and charge admission.
Makes sense. Okay, so externalities and public goods are major culprits. What other factors lead to market failure?
Well, we also have information asymmetry.
Information asymmetry. Sounds complex.
It just means that one party in a transaction has significantly more or maybe better information than the other party.
Ah, like buying a used car.
That's the classic example. The seller likely knows much more about its history, its quirks, its potential problems than you, the buyer, do.
Yeah.
And this imbalance, this asymmetry, can lead to inefficient or, frankly, unfair outcomes.
Right, if the seller knows the car has a dodgy engine but doesn't tell me, I could end up paying too much for a lemon. It's a market transaction, sure, but it's based on unequal information.
Precisely. Then there's market power.
Okay.
This occurs when a single company that's a monopoly, or maybe a small group of companies, an oligopoly, have enough control over the market to manipulate prices and restrict competition.
Right, so they can kind of dictate terms.
Yeah. And in a smaller economy like Ireland, the risk of concentrated market power in certain sectors can be a particular concern. It could limit consumer choice, drive up costs.
Not great for consumers or the overall economy.
No, we also have the tragedy of the commons.
Ah, yes. This one sounds dramatic.
It describes the overuse and depletion of shared resources when there are no clear rules or ownership structures in place. Think about the fishing quotas we often hear about in the news.
Like everyone rushing to catch as many fish as possible without thinking about whether there'll be any fish left next year.
Exactly that. The source material specifically mentions overfishing in Irish waters and the EU's common fisheries policy setting quotas for species like cod and mackerel. That's an attempt to prevent this type of market failure.
Right, a regulation to stop the shared resource, the fish stocks from being completely exhausted.
Which would harm everyone in the fishing industry, and consumers too, in the long run.
And finally, any other causes?
Just briefly, we have merit and demerit goods.
Okay.
Merit goods are things society believes are beneficial, but people might underconsume them if left to the market. Think vaccinations, maybe basic education.
Right.
Demerit goods are the opposite, seen as harmful, but might be overconsumed. Tobacco, perhaps excessive alcohol consumption.
So because the market doesn't fully capture the wider societal benefits of, say, herd immunity from vaccines or the massive societal costs of smoking-related healthcare.
Exactly. Intervention might be needed to encourage the merit goods or discourage the demerit goods.
Okay. Now, all these different types of failures, they obviously have consequences, right? Significant impacts.
Oh, absolutely. Significant impacts on society.
So what's the fallout when the market doesn't do its job properly? What happens?
Well, the big one economists often talk about is deadweight loss.
Deadweight loss.
Yeah, it's essentially a loss of potential value in the economy. Think of it as value just disappearing because the market isn't operating optimally, like a missed opportunity for mutually beneficial transactions that just don't happen.
Okay.
But beyond that, market failure can also make inequality worse. It can certainly harm the environment, as we saw with the pollution example, and it can leave essential needs unmet, which is why there's often a strong rationale for some form of intervention, government or otherwise.
Okay, so that's market failure in broad strokes. Now let's shift gears slightly. What about partial market failure? How does that differ from this complete failure idea?
Right. So partial market failure is when the market is generally functioning. Goods and services are being bought and sold, but it's producing inefficient or maybe unfair outcomes in specific areas, or perhaps for certain groups of people.
Okay.
It's not a complete absence of a functioning market, like we might see with, say, pure public goods, where the private market just wouldn't step in at all.
So the market isn't totally broken, but it's experiencing significant issues in certain pockets, or for certain people.
That's a great way to put it, exactly. Yeah. We see localized inefficiency. The market might work reasonably well for some, maybe in cities, but not for others, perhaps in rural areas.
Okay.
Often, these partial failures involve issues like localized externalities or information gaps that affect particular groups more than others, or barriers to access that could potentially be addressed without, fundamentally overhauling the entire market.
Right.
And crucially, partial failures often raise serious concerns about equity and fairness. Are the outcomes just?
So it's not that a market for something doesn't exist at all. It's more that it's not operating effectively or fairly for everyone, or maybe in every situation.
Exactly. Think about it in terms of the scope and the severity of the problem.
Yeah.
A complete market failure, like the lack of a private market for clean air because pollution is such a widespread externality that requires a more fundamental fix, probably large-scale government regulation.
Sure.
A partial market failure, on the other hand, like, say, a healthcare market that doesn't adequately serve rural areas, well, that might be addressed with more targeted, maybe localized interventions.
That distinction is helpful. So can you give us some specific examples of these partial market failures, particularly within the Irish context, as our sources highlight?
Yeah, definitely. A really clear example is healthcare access in rural Ireland.
Okay.
We have a healthcare market, there are private doctors, dentists, facilities, but access isn't evenly distributed across the country.
Sure.
It just isn't.
Right.
Private healthcare providers, they tend to concentrate in urban centers, Dublin, Cork, Galway, which can leave people living in more remote rural areas heavily reliant on often stretched public services or facing really significant travel times to get the care they need.
Yeah, I can see that.
And in a smaller country like Ireland, this geographical disparity in access can have a really big impact on the well-being of those rural communities.
So the healthcare market functions generally, but geographically, it's not serving the entire population equally or efficiently. I remember the 2019 Slanacare report really brought those regional disparities into sharp focus, didn't it? Mentioning places like Donegal and Kerry specifically.
Absolutely did. And government initiatives you hear about aimed at expanding primary care centers or investing in rural healthcare infrastructure, those are attempts to address this partial failure.
To try and make the existing market work better.
Exactly. To make it work more effectively and equitably for those communities that are currently underserved.
Another really prominent example, definitely from our sources, has got to be the housing market in Dublin.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it's definitely a functioning market. Properties are bought, sold, rented constantly, but it feels like it's failing a huge portion of the population with those incredibly high prices and the chronic lack of supply.
Exactly right. The market operates, but it's producing outcomes that exclude many low and even middle-income households from homeownership or even finding affordable rental options. It's incredibly tough. And this can be driven by various factors like speculative investment maybe, which can inflate prices beyond what's sustainable for ordinary buyers. That's almost like a negative externality itself.
Yeah.
And also information asymmetries, perhaps around the complexities of planning permission or development risks.
And the figures are stark. That average house price in Dublin surpassing €500,000 back in 2023. That really illustrates the severity, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows the impact this partial market failure has on the social fabric, on young people, on families.
And the government has tried to intervene, with schemes like the Help to Buy program and various social housing initiatives. But the underlying supply issues just seem incredibly persistent. It really highlights how even tackling a partial market failure can be a deeply complex challenge.
It really does. And a final example our source touches on is in the realm of education, specifically around information asymmetry.
Education. How so?
Well, Ireland has quite a significant market for private education and supplementary tutoring. The place is often called grind schools.
Right.
However, parents might lack complete and reliable information about the actual quality and effectiveness of different providers. It's hard to judge from the outside.
Okay.
Some providers might perhaps overstate their success rates or make unrealistic promises, basically exploiting that information gap. And this is particularly relevant in a system where, let's face it, educational outcomes can have a really significant impact on future opportunities.
So parents are engaging with this market. They're paying for a service they believe will benefit their children, but they might not actually be getting the best value or the outcomes they expect just because of a lack of transparency and reliable info.
Precisely. And while the Department of Education is taking steps, like publishing school performance data to increase transparency, there are still persistent disparities in educational outcomes, particularly for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. This suggests, a partial failure in ensuring truly equitable access to quality education, whether public or private.
Okay, so we've explored the distinction between complete and partial failure and looked at some really relevant Irish examples. Now, how do we actually go about tackling these different types of market failures? Are the solutions similar for both?
Generally speaking, no. They tend to differ quite a bit. Addressing complete market failures often requires more significant, more direct government intervention. Well, it can take the form of regulation. Think setting environmental standards for emissions, like carbon limits, or establishing those fishing quotas we mentioned to prevent overexploitation.
Yeah.
It can also involve public provision, where the government directly provides the good or service itself. National defense is the classic example again.
Right.
The use of taxes and subsidies is another key tool. The idea is to internalize those externalities we talked about.
So make the polluter pay, essentially.
Yeah, carbon taxes make polluting activities more expensive. Or, on the flip side, subsidies for renewable energy make cleaner alternatives more financially attractive.
Got it.
And in some cases, clearly defining and enforcing property rights over shared resources can help avoid that tragedy of the commons.
Okay.
Ireland's Climate Action Plan 2023, for instance, with its specific emissions reduction targets for the agricultural sector. That's a direct example of government intervention trying to correct a market failure related to environmental externalities.
Those all sound like fairly large-scale government actions. What about the more localized, more nuanced issues of partial market failure, the housing situation, or rural healthcare?
Yeah, for partial market failures, the interventions tend to be more targeted, more tailored to the specific problem.
How so?
We might see subsidies or financial incentives directed at specific areas, like supporting healthcare professionals who choose to practice in rural communities, or maybe incentivizing developers to build affordable housing in cities.
Okay, targeted money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Information campaigns can be crucial too, especially in addressing those information asymmetries we discussed in education or maybe consumer protection. Just letting people know what their options are, what quality looks like.
Makes sense.
Regulation can still play a role, definitely. For instance, implementing rent caps or controls in overheated housing markets, though that's often controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes public-private partnerships can be an effective approach. You combine perhaps the efficiency and innovation of the private sector with public goals, like in providing social housing. Ireland's Housing for All strategy, which includes measures both to increase housing supply and regulate things like short-term rentals, that really exemplifies this more targeted approach to tackling a partial market failure.
It really sounds like there's a whole toolkit of potential solutions, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation, is it?
Absolutely not. And it's really crucial here to remember the concept of government failure.
Ah, right. So intervention isn't always the magic bullet.
Exactly. Just because a market isn't working perfectly doesn't automatically mean that government intervention will improve things. Sometimes interventions are poorly designed or inefficiently implemented or maybe politically motivated,
Yeah.
and they can actually end up making the situation worse. They can lead to unintended consequences, further inefficiencies.
Are there examples of that?
Well, the source material kind of alludes to potential examples in Ireland, like maybe delays in delivering social housing projects, or perhaps overly complex and bureaucratic planning regulations that slow things down unintentionally.
So the intended cure can sometimes be less effective than hoped, or even create new problems on the side.
Precisely. And we also need to constantly consider this inherent tension between equity and efficiency.
Fairness versus the bottom line, almost.
Kind of. Partial market failures, in particular, often disproportionately affect vulnerable or marginalized groups in society. Think about low-income families struggling with Dublin housing costs. So policymakers face this ongoing challenge. How do you balance maximizing overall economic welfare efficiency with ensuring fair and just outcomes for all citizens' equity?
It's a really complex balancing act, isn't it, with no easy answers. And these issues, these failures, they aren't unique to Ireland, are they? This happens everywhere.
Oh, not at all. The sources provide some valuable global context, too. They point to the near-complete market failure in the initial under-provision of global vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, that required massive international cooperation, like COVAX.
Exactly. The market alone wasn't going to solve that equitably or quickly enough. And then you have persistent partial market failures, like severe urban air pollution in megacities like Delhi. That requires targeted, often really stringent regulations on industry and transport to even begin to tackle it. So these international examples, they just underscore that market failures in all their various forms and degrees are a widespread challenge for economies everywhere.
So to kind of bring it all together then, what are the key takeaways from our deep dive into market failure and partial market failure today? What should listeners really grasp?
I think the central distinction is between that fundamental breakdown in the market's ability to function efficiently, that's complete market failure, and these more localized areas of inefficiency or inequity within a generally operating market, which is partial market failure.
Right.
And our example from Ireland, think the environmental impact of agriculture versus the challenges of rural healthcare access or the Dublin housing market. They really help illustrate this crucial difference, I think.
Yeah, one often requires more fundamental, maybe widespread government intervention, while the other might be addressed through more targeted policies, maybe tweaks and adjustments.
Precisely. And recognizing these failures when they occur, understanding their underlying causes, why is this happening, and then carefully evaluating the potential remedies. including the risk of government failure. That's absolutely essential for effective policymaking.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal, really, should always be to enhance both the efficiency and the fairness of our economic systems.
And it really seems like in Ireland, just like in many other countries, the ongoing challenge is finding that, well, that delicate balance between fostering economic growth and ensuring strong social and environmental well-being when you're grappling with these inevitable market shortcomings.
Absolutely. It's a continuous process, really.
Yeah.
Identifying where the market falls short and then striving to implement the most appropriate and effective solutions, sometimes big, sometimes small, to steer things back on track, or at least in a more desirable direction for society as a whole.
So, considering everything we've discussed today, from agricultural pollution and the Dublin housing crisis to healthcare access in rural areas and even the market for private tutoring, what other areas of the Irish economy do you think might exhibit some characteristics of market failure or partial market failure? It's an interesting thought. And what specific kinds of information or data would you even need to look at to make a more informed assessment? Definitely something for listeners to mull over.